There are some stories you don't tell right away. Not because you don't remember them, but because remembering still costs you something. This is one of those stories. And if you're listening to this and you're somewhere between 45 and 70, you already know what I mean. Because back then, we were taught something different. We were taught to be strong, to keep things together, to not run our mouth, to handle our business quietly, especially women.
I feel like this story will truly touch a woman's heart. It might feel very similar to your own story. Listen till the end, then tell me in the comments, were you right or was your partner wrong? If you enjoy real-life stories like this, please subscribe to the channel. Now, without wasting any time, let's start the story.
Especially pregnant women, especially Black women, and especially wives who didn't want to be another statistic. So when he left me while I was pregnant, I didn't cry in public. I didn't call everybody I knew. I didn't beg. I didn't scream. I stayed silent. And at the time, I thought that silence was maturity. I thought it was dignity. I thought it was strength. But silence has a way of aging badly, and some lessons don't show up until years later, when the house is quiet, the children are grown, and the excuses don't work anymore. Let me take you back. I was 6 months pregnant when he told me. 6 months. That stage where your body doesn't belong to you anymore, where you don't sleep comfortably, where your back hurts for no reason, where strangers feel entitled to touch your stomach in the grocery store. That stage where people smile at you like everything is beautiful, even when your insides are screaming. I remember exactly where I was standing. Kitchen. Bare feet on cold tile, dishwater running. I had one hand on my lower back, trying to ease the pressure, and the other wrapped around the edge of the sink like it might float away. He didn't sit down. That should have been my first clue. Men who plan to stay usually sit. He stayed standing, keys already in his hand, and that's when he said it. I don't think I can do this anymore. Not us, not this family, just this. Like I was a project, like the pregnancy was a bad investment. I waited for the rest of the sentence, because surely there had to be more. There always is. But there wasn't. Silence filled the kitchen so loud I could hear the refrigerator humming. And I did something that surprises people when I tell them now. I nodded. That's it. I nodded. No tears, no questions, no, what about the baby? No, what did I do? Just a nod. He looked relieved. That part took me years to admit. He looked relieved, as if my silence had given him permission to leave clean. And before I knew it, the door closed behind him. Not slammed, not dramatic, just closed. And that was it. Now, let me pause right here and ask you something. Have you ever held something so heavy inside that people mistook your quiet for strength? Have you ever stayed calm in a moment where you should have screamed because you didn't want to be seen as emotional, dramatic, or weak? Because that's where I was. I told myself all the things we tell ourselves. I don't want stress for the baby. I can handle this. I'll figure it out. God wouldn't give me more than I can bear. And listen, I believe in God, but sometimes we use faith to avoid truth. Sometimes we spiritualize what is actually emotional neglect. And I did that a lot. The next morning, I woke up alone. No snoring beside me, no warm body to steal the covers, just quiet. The kind of quiet that feels unnatural. I made breakfast out of habit. 2 eggs, 2 slices of toast. Then I realized there was no one else to feed. So I stood there, staring at the stove, laughing softly to myself like I'd caught a joke too late. "Well," I said out loud, "guess it's just you and me now." I was talking to my belly, and for the first time, I felt fear. Real fear. not panic fear, the kind that sits in your chest and doesn't move. But even then, I didn't call him, I didn't tell my mother, I didn't tell my sisters, I didn't tell my church friends. I told myself, I'll say something when I have answers. But silence doesn't wait for answers. Silence settles in. People at work noticed before I said anything. "Where your husband at? He's been busy lately? Y'all okay?" And I'd smile. "Oh, he's working a lot." That lie tasted bitter every time, but it felt easier than the truth, because the truth would have required me to feel something, and I didn't think I had time for that. I was pregnant. Bills don't pause for heartbreak. Life keeps moving, and so did I, quietly. Here's the part nobody talks about. When someone leaves you during pregnancy, they don't just leave the relationship. They leave you holding everything: the fear, the uncertainty, the future. But because my body was already changing, I convinced myself that the emotional weight was just hormones. I minimized my own pain. I told myself I was being dramatic. I told myself women had survived worse. And that may be true, but surviving isn't the same as healing. Weeks passed, then months. He didn't come back, but he also didn't disappear completely. He'd check in occasionally, a text here, a short call there. "How you feeling? Baby kicking yet?" Notice what he didn't ask. He never asked how I was doing. Not really. And I never corrected him. I answered politely, briefly. I kept the conversation about the baby, because that felt safer. It kept me from asking the questions I didn't want answers to. Let me say this gently. Silence can become a habit, and habits shape relationships. The more I stayed quiet, the more he assumed I was fine. The more he assumed I was fine, the less responsibility he felt. And the less responsibility he felt, the easier it became for him to stay gone. I didn't realize it at the time, but my silence was teaching him how to treat me, and I was an excellent teacher. The day I went into labor, he wasn't there. Not because he couldn't make it, because I didn't ask. I told myself, I don't want to bother him. That sentence has haunted me. I didn't want to bother the man who helped create this child. So I labored alone. Not completely alone. Nurses, doctors, sounds, movement. But emotionally, alone. And when I finally held my baby, I smiled. Because that's what you do. You smile for the pictures. You smile for the moment. But something cracked inside me that day. Just a little. I didn't know it yet. After the baby was born, people assumed things had worked themselves out. Men always come around once the baby gets here. Give him time. At least he's checking in. And again, I stayed silent. I didn't correct them, because correcting people would have forced me to admit something painful. He didn't leave because he didn't love the baby. He left because he didn't want the responsibility of me. And that truth takes time to swallow. Years passed, and from the outside, I looked like I had it together. I raised my child, I worked, I kept moving. I became the strong one, the one people admired. She handled that so well. She never complained. She's so independent. What they didn't know was that my strength was built on unspoken grief, and grief doesn't disappear when ignored. It waits, patiently. Time has a strange way of smoothing things over, not healing them, just dulling the edges. And after a while, you start mistaking numbness for peace. That's what happened to me. The years didn't bring clarity right away. They brought routine. And routine is dangerous because it convinces you that this is just how life is now. My child grew. Not all at once, but steadily. First steps. First words. First day of school. Moments that should have been shared. Moments I told myself I didn't need help with. And to be fair, I handled it. I really did. I learned how to carry groceries and a baby at the same time, how to run on 3 hours of sleep, how to stretch a dollar until it cried for mercy. I learned how to answer questions with a smile. Where's your daddy? Oh, he loves you very much. That sentence became my shield. It protected my child from confusion and protected me from having to explain something I didn't fully understand myself. Because how do you explain emotional absence to a child? And how do you explain your own silence to yourself? He remained present enough. Birthday cards, occasional visits, phone calls that never lasted too long, just enough to avoid guilt. Not enough to build anything real. And I didn't challenge it. I told myself, at least he's trying. But here's the truth I didn't want to admit. I was afraid to ask for more. Afraid that if I spoke up, he would disappear completely. And I wasn't sure I could survive that kind of abandonment. So I accepted crumbs, and I taught my child how to do the same, without ever meaning to. Let me ask you something. Have you ever lowered your expectations, not because you wanted less, but because asking for more felt too risky? That's where silence leads you. It doesn't scream, it whispers. It says, be grateful. It says, don't rock the boat. It says, you've already come this far. And before you know it, you're living a life you never agreed to, but never protested either. Years later, I ran into him at a family event. Not planned, one of those moments life throws at you without warning, like it's testing how healed you really are. He looked older. So did I. There was that awkward pause people have when they don't know which version of the past to acknowledge. We hugged, polite, careful. He asked about our child. I answered. Then he said something that caught me off guard. You know, I always admired how strong you were back then. Strong. That word again. It followed me like a compliment that didn't feel like one. I smiled, because that's what I always did, but inside something stirred. Admired my strength or appreciated my silence. Because strength doesn't mean you weren't hurting, and silence doesn't mean you didn't need support. But men sometimes confuse quiet women for unbreakable ones, and I had helped him believe that. After that day, he started calling more, checking in, asking questions. Real questions. How was it for you? Was it hard? I wanted to laugh, not because it was funny, but because of the timing. Where were these questions when I needed them most? Where was this curiosity when my body was carrying more than it could handle? Still, I answered calmly, truthfully, but softly, because even then, I wasn't ready to open the door all the way. Silence had become my language. Let me be honest. Silence feels safer than honesty, until honesty becomes unavoidable. I had built my entire emotional life around not needing him, and suddenly he wanted to talk. That scared me more than his absence ever did, because reopening old wounds means admitting they were never healed. One evening, after a long phone call, I sat in my living room in the dark. No TV, no music, just me and my thoughts. And for the first time in years, I asked myself a dangerous question. What would have happened if I had spoken up back then? Not accused, not begged, just spoken. Would he have stayed? Would things have been different? Or would the truth have come out sooner? That question doesn't have an answer, and unanswered questions have a way of keeping you up at night. Here's something nobody tells you. Delayed grief is heavier than immediate grief. When pain comes all at once, you can process it. But when pain stretches over years, when it hides behind strength and responsibility, it settles into your bones. And one day, you wake up tired without knowing why. That was me. Tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. I started noticing things about myself. I avoided conflict at all costs. I apologized when I didn't need to. I swallowed words that deserved air. I had mastered emotional self-neglect, and it started during that pregnancy when I learned that my feelings were inconvenient. My child grew into adulthood. Smart, observant. One day they asked me a question I wasn't prepared for. "Mom, why don't you ever get mad at Dad?" I froze, because children see more than we think, and they feel the gaps we try to hide. I opened my mouth to answer, and nothing came out. Silence, again. But this time, it felt heavy with regret. I told myself I'd answer later, but later never comes when you keep postponing truth. And that night, I cried. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears, the kind that come from realizing something too late. I realized that my silence hadn't just protected me, it had shaped my child's understanding of relationships. They had watched me endure, but never assert. They had seen strength, but not boundaries. And that realization hurt more than anything he ever did. Here's the uncomfortable truth. When you stay silent long enough, people build a story about you. They decide what you can handle, what you need, what you deserve. And correcting that story later takes more courage than speaking up in the beginning ever would have. He eventually apologized, years later. A real apology, not perfect, but sincere. I wasn't ready. I was scared. I didn't know how to show up. I listened. I nodded, because by then I had practiced that response for decades. But something inside me whispered, this apology would have meant everything years ago. Now, it felt like closure that came after the door had already closed. And that's where regret begins to take shape. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet understanding that timing matters. And silence, while it feels noble, can steal time you never get back. There comes a point in life, usually later than we'd like, when you stop asking why they did what they did and start asking why you allowed it. That question doesn't arrive gently. It doesn't knock. It barges in when you're least prepared. For me, it came on an ordinary afternoon. No drama, no argument, no announcement. Just a quiet moment that cracked something open. I was cleaning out an old drawer. One of those drawers we all have, the kind that collects years of, "I'll deal with this later." Old bills, cards with faded ink, photos you forgot existed, and at the bottom, I found a folded piece of paper. Hospital paperwork from the day I gave birth. My name, my signature, emergency contact, blank. I stared at that empty line longer than I should have. Emergency contact? There was no one listed. Not because I didn't know anyone, but because at the time, I didn't want to inconvenience anyone. Even in labor, even in pain, even bringing life into the world. That's when it hit me. I hadn't just stayed silent with him, I had stayed silent with everyone. Let me tell you something real. Silence doesn't start as self-neglect. It starts as survival. You tell yourself, "I'll handle it." You tell yourself, "Others have it worse." You tell yourself, "This will pass." And for a while, it works. Until one day, it doesn't. and you're left wondering when you stopped mattering to yourself. I sat on the floor that day, didn't even make it to the couch, just sat there, paperwork in my lap, asking a question I'd avoided for years. Why didn't I think I deserved more support? Not from him, from myself. Why did I believe that my pain needed permission to exist? We don't talk enough about how women, especially our generation, were taught to disappear quietly, to make things easier, to not ask for too much, to carry the weight without complaint. And if you're listening to this and nodding, you know exactly what I mean. We were praised for endurance, not honesty, for sacrifice, not boundaries. And I had internalized that lesson so deeply, I didn't even realize I was still living by it. That afternoon, I called a friend. Not to vent, not to cry, just to say the words out loud. He left me while I was pregnant, and I never talked about it. There was silence on the other end. Then she said something simple. That must have been lonely. Lonely. Not weak, not dramatic, not foolish. Lonely. And something broke open, because loneliness had been the truth all along. I just didn't think I was allowed to name it. Here's what silence does. It convinces you that if you don't speak about something, it didn't affect you that much. But the body remembers, the mind remembers, and the heart keeps score, even when you pretend not to. After that call, I started noticing patterns, how I avoided asking for help, how I minimized my needs, how I said, "It's fine," when it wasn't. I had built an entire personality around being low maintenance, and I started asking myself a new question. Who taught me that needing support was a flaw? Because it wasn't something I was born believing, it was learned. I thought back to that kitchen. Cold tile, keys in his hand, me nodding, and I realized something painful. I didn't stay silent because I was calm. I stayed silent because I was scared. Scared of confrontation, scared of abandonment, scared of confirming that I wasn't enough. And silence felt like control. If I didn't speak, I couldn't be rejected again. Let me pause and ask you something, and be honest with yourself. How many times have you stayed quiet, not because you didn't have anything to say, but because you were afraid of what might happen if you did? That fear doesn't disappear with age, it just gets better at hiding. Breaking silence doesn't always look dramatic. For me, it started small. I said no, without explaining. I disagreed, without apologizing. I asked for help, without justifying it. And every time I did, my chest tightened. Because growth is uncomfortable when you've lived your life shrinking. I eventually spoke to him. Not to blame, not to argue, just to tell the truth I had swallowed for years. I was hurt. I felt abandoned. I needed you, and I didn't say it. He listened, really listened, and for the first time, I didn't manage his emotions. I didn't soften my words to protect him. I let my truth stand on its own. And something surprising happened. I felt lighter. Not because he fixed anything, but because I finally honored myself. Here's the part that's hard to accept. Speaking up years later doesn't undo the past. It doesn't rewrite history, but it does change the story you tell yourself about who you are. I stopped seeing myself as the woman who was left and started seeing myself as the woman who survived and learned. But regret doesn't disappear just because you find your voice. It shifts. It becomes quieter, but sharper. Because once you know better, you start seeing all the moments you could have spoken. And that awareness can sting. Regret doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always come with tears or breakdowns or dramatic moments you see in movies. Sometimes regret shows up quietly, in reflection, in hindsight, in the spaces where things could have been different. For me, regret arrived not as pain, but as clarity. And clarity can hurt more than confusion ever did. It happened on a Sunday afternoon. The house was clean, the day was slow, one of those rare moments when there was nothing demanding my attention. And that's when regret found room to speak. I was watching my child, grown now, move through the world with confidence, strong, capable, and yet cautious, careful with emotions, slow to ask for help, quick to say, "I've got it." I recognize that behavior because it used to be mine. And that's when the weight of it hit me. Not what his absence did, but what my silence modeled. We teach our children far more by example than explanation. I had explained love, I had explained resilience, but what I had demonstrated was endurance without expression. And I wondered how many times my child had learned to swallow feelings just by watching me do it. That thought stayed with me. Here's something we rarely say out loud. You can be a good parent and still pass down unhealed patterns, not intentionally, not maliciously, just quietly. And silence is excellent at traveling through generations. I thought back to all the times I told myself, I'm protecting my child. I don't want them caught in adult issues. I don't want to create bitterness. Those intentions were pure, but intention doesn't erase impact, and the impact of silence is often misunderstanding. One night, we sat at the table together, talking about life, work, relationships, and then my child said something that stopped me cold. I don't think I ever want to rely on anyone too much. Not angry, not bitter, just matter of fact. I nodded, but inside, something twisted, because that sentence sounded familiar. It sounded like a lesson learned early without ever being spoken. Let me be clear. Silence doesn't just keep peace, it teaches avoidance. And avoidance can look like independence until it starts costing you connection. I began reflecting more honestly, not beating myself up, just looking back with eyes I didn't have then. I realized I had confused being low maintenance with being emotionally healthy. I thought asking for less meant being stronger, but strength isn't measured by how much you can carry alone. It's measured by how willing you are to be seen. And I wasn't seen, by choice. Regret also showed up in smaller ways, like realizing I never gave myself permission to grieve. Not fully. I went from pregnant woman to single mother without ever stopping to mourn the life I thought I was building. I told myself, it is what it is. But grief doesn't disappear when dismissed. It waits. There were nights I lay awake replaying moments. That kitchen, that nod, that quiet acceptance. Not to punish myself, but to understand. Because understanding is how we make peace with the past. Here's something I wish I had known earlier. Speaking up doesn't guarantee someone will stay, but staying silent guarantees you'll carry unanswered questions, and unanswered questions can follow you for decades. I asked myself, if I had spoken up, would I have felt less regret, even if the outcome was the same? And the answer was yes, because regret isn't always about loss. Sometimes it's about not honoring your truth when it mattered most. That realization was heavy, but it was also freeing, because it meant the regret wasn't about him. It was about me learning, too late, that my voice mattered. Forgiveness is a word people love to use casually. Just forgive. Let it go. Make peace with it.
But nobody really tells you how complicated forgiveness becomes when the person you need to forgive is yourself. For a long time, I believed I had forgiven him. And maybe I had. I wasn't angry anymore. I didn't replay arguments. I didn't wish him harm. I had reached a calm place. But calm isn't always forgiveness. Sometimes it's emotional distance, and distance is easier than honesty. The truth was, the resentment I carried wasn't for him. It was for the woman I used to be. The woman who nodded instead of speaking, the woman who swallowed pain to keep the peace, the woman who confused silence with grace. And that resentment was harder to face because you can't rewrite your own past. I would catch myself thinking things like, why didn't you say something? Why didn't you stand up for yourself? Why did you make it so easy for him to walk away? Those questions can be cruel when you ask them with today's wisdom, but yesterday's version of you didn't have what you have now. She didn't know what silence would cost. She was doing the best she could with what she understood at the time. And that took me a long time to accept. Let me tell you something important. Self-forgiveness doesn't come from excusing your choices. It comes from understanding them. I had to stop judging my younger self from the comfort of hindsight. She was pregnant. She was scared. She was raised to endure. She wasn't weak. She was surviving. I remember sitting alone one evening, thinking about that younger version of me, the one in the kitchen, bare feet on cold tile, heart pounding, pretending to be calm. And for the first time, I felt compassion instead of criticism. I realized she didn't stay silent because she didn't care. She stayed silent because she cared too much about appearances, about stability, about not being abandoned completely. Silence felt like the safest option she had. We don't talk enough about how fear disguises itself as strength. How many women have stayed quiet not because they lacked courage, but because they were afraid of losing what little security they had. Fear doesn't make you foolish, it makes you human. I started speaking differently to myself. When the regret crept in, I didn't push it away. I asked it questions. What were you trying to protect? What did you need back then? What were you afraid would happen if you spoke? And slowly, the answers came. I was afraid of being alone. I was afraid of confirming rejection. I was afraid of becoming that woman. So I chose silence. And silence chose consequences. Forgiving myself didn't mean pretending those consequences didn't exist. It meant accepting that I can't change them, but I can learn from them. That distinction matters, because when you refuse to forgive yourself, you stay stuck in punishment mode, and punishment doesn't heal anything. Here's something that surprised me. Once I started forgiving myself, my view of him shifted too, not because he deserved more grace, but because I no longer needed to hold on to resentment to justify my pain. I could acknowledge his failures without tying them to my worth. That was freedom. My child noticed the change before I said anything. I started speaking up more. Not harshly, not angrily, just honestly. I expressed needs, I set boundaries, I allowed myself to be disappointed without pretending I wasn't. And one day, my child said, "You seem lighter, Mom." That one sentence told me everything. Let me pause and ask you something personal. When you look back at your life, is there a version of yourself you still judge harshly? A moment you replay thinking, I should have known better?
Maybe you did the best you could with the information you had. Maybe that version of you deserves understanding, not punishment. Self-forgiveness doesn't erase regret, but it softens it. It turns regret into wisdom instead of shame. And wisdom is something you can pass on.
This story might feel close to your own life. Please listen till the end and share your thoughts in the comments. For more real stories like this, consider subscribing.
We like to believe that once something is over, it's over. That when a chapter closes, it stays in the past. But silence doesn't respect timelines. It follows you, quietly, into new relationships, new seasons, new versions of yourself. And I didn't realize how deeply silence had shaped me until I tried to love again. Years after everything happened, someone new entered my life. Kind, consistent, present. The kind of man people describe as safe. And that should have been comforting. But instead, it made me uneasy. Because when you've learned to survive without support, support can feel unfamiliar, almost suspicious. He would ask simple questions. How are you really doing? What do you need from me? And I would freeze. Not because I didn't have answers, but because I wasn't used to being asked. Silence had trained me to handle things alone. It had trained me to minimize, to say, I'm fine, even when I wasn't. Let me be honest. Silence doesn't just teach you to endure pain. It teaches you to avoid vulnerability. And vulnerability is essential for love. Without it, relationships stay shallow, polite, but distant. I didn't know how to let someone all the way in. I noticed patterns repeating. I wouldn't express disappointment until it turned into withdrawal. I wouldn't ask for reassurance until I felt disconnected. I wouldn't speak until the moment passed. Silence had become my emotional reflex. One evening, he said something that stopped me. You disappear when something bothers you. Not accusing, observing. And I realized he was right. I would go quiet, just like I had years ago, just like I thought I had outgrown. That's when it hit me. Silence wasn't just something I did back then. It was something I had become comfortable with. It felt safer than risking conflict, safer than possibly being left again. Let me ask you something. Have you ever pushed people away without raising your voice, without saying a word? That's the quiet damage of silence. I had to make a choice. Keep protecting myself the way I always had, or learn a new way. And learning a new way meant unlearning silence. That wasn't easy, because silence had kept me alive, but survival isn't the same as living. I started small. I said things like, that hurt my feelings. I felt overlooked. I need reassurance right now. My voice shook the first few times, because speaking after years of silence feels like learning a new language. But each time I spoke, something shifted. I felt present, engaged, seen. Here's the truth no one prepares you for. Breaking old patterns doesn't feel empowering at first. It feels terrifying. Because when you speak up, you risk disappointment. But when you stay silent, you guarantee disconnection. And I had already lived that life. I began to understand something important. Silence didn't just affect how I was treated, it affected how I allowed myself to be loved. I had unconsciously chosen emotional independence over emotional intimacy, and that choice came with a cost. My child noticed the difference too. They saw me expressing emotions openly, setting boundaries, naming needs, and one day they said, I didn't know you could do that. Not judgment, amazement. That sentence stayed with me because it reminded me that growth, even late, still teaches. I realized then that silence had been my teacher, but it didn't have to be my legacy.
I could choose differently now, and so could the people watching me. There's a stage of healing people don't talk about enough. It comes after anger, after understanding, after forgiveness. It's the moment you stop wishing the past were different, not because it doesn't hurt anymore, but because you finally accept that it is finished. That's reconciliation, not with a person, with reality. For years, I replayed that moment in the kitchen, the keys in his hand, my nod. I imagined different versions of myself, the one who spoke up, the one who asked him to stay, the one who demanded better. But imagination doesn't change history, it only keeps you tied to it. And one day, I realized something quiet but powerful. I was done rehearsing old scenes. That realization didn't come all at once. It came in small moments, like the day I realized I could remember my pregnancy without feeling tight in my chest, or the moment I spoke about that time in my life without rushing through it. I wasn't numb, I was at peace. Let me be clear. Peace doesn't mean approval. It doesn't mean what happened was okay. It means you stop arguing with what already occurred. And that shift changes everything. I had a conversation with him not long after. Not emotional, not heavy, just honest. We talked about the past like two people who had both lived long enough to see their mistakes clearly. He admitted things he'd never said before. I was selfish. I didn't know how to show up. I thought your silence meant you didn't need me. That last sentence stayed with me, because silence sends messages, even when you don't intend it to. I told him something I'd never said out loud. I thought staying quiet would keep me safe. He nodded, not defensively, understanding. We weren't trying to fix anything, we were acknowledging it, and that mattered. Reconciliation isn't about reopening doors, it's about closing them properly. No resentment trapped inside, no unspoken words echoing, just acceptance. Here's what I learned during that season. You don't make peace with the past by minimizing it. You make peace with it by telling the truth, even if only to yourself. I also learned that regret softens when you stop using it as a weapon against yourself. When you say, that happened. I learned. I grew. And then you move forward. I stopped asking, what if I had spoken up? And started asking, what did silence teach me? Because lessons are the only things we can take from the past. Everything else stays behind. I began sharing my story more, not in detail, not for sympathy, but for connection. And I noticed something. Other women would lean in. They'd say things like, I thought I was the only one. I stayed quiet too. I didn't know it would follow me like this. Silence isolates. Truth connects. That's when I understood something bigger. My story wasn't just mine. It was familiar, and familiarity creates healing. The past didn't disappear, but it lost its grip. It became something I could hold without being consumed by it. And that's how you know reconciliation has happened. When people talk about legacy, they usually mean what you leave behind: money, property, keepsakes. But emotional legacy is different. It's what you pass forward, and most of the time, you don't even realize you're doing it. I started thinking more seriously about legacy when my child began navigating adulthood, careers, relationships, decisions that shape the rest of their life. I watched closely, not to control, but to understand, and I saw pieces of myself in the way they moved through the world, the good and the unfinished. They were independent, resourceful, strong, all things I was proud of. But I also noticed something else. They hesitated to lean on others. They struggled to express disappointment. They took responsibility quickly, sometimes too quickly, and I knew where that came from. We don't just teach our children what to say, we teach them what to tolerate, what to endure, what to normalize. And for years, I had normalized silence. There came a moment, unexpected, unplanned, when I realized I needed to say something. We were talking about relationships. Nothing heavy, just conversation. And my child said, "I think it's better not to expect too much from people." That sentence landed heavy because it sounded wise, but it wasn't. It was protective, and protection can limit love. I took a breath, and for the first time, I spoke plainly. "I used to think that too," I said, "and it cost me more than I realized." They looked at me, surprised, because I didn't usually talk about the past like that. I didn't go into detail. I didn't need to. I just said, staying silent doesn't always make things easier. Sometimes it just delays the pain. They listened, really listened, and in that moment, I felt something shift. Legacy isn't about perfection. It's about honesty. It's about saying, "This is what I learned the hard way, so you don't have to." I realized then that my voice, used now, could still change something. Maybe not the past, but the future, and that mattered. I also started paying attention to my own habits, how often I said, "It's fine," when it wasn't, how often I minimized my needs, and each time I asked myself, is this silence or is this peace? Because they are not the same. Here's a truth worth sitting with. Peace feels grounded. Silence feels heavy. And once you know the difference, you can't unknow it. I made a quiet promise to myself. I would stop passing down silence. I would speak, not harshly, not dramatically, but honestly, because honesty creates clarity, and clarity creates healthier connections. I watched how that choice rippled outward. My child became more open, more expressive, more willing to ask for support. Not overnight, but steadily. And that was enough. For most of my life, I believed strength looked a certain way. Quiet, composed, unbothered. Strength meant you didn't fall apart, you didn't complain, you didn't ask. You handled it. And if I'm being honest, that version of strength earned me a lot of praise. People admired it. They said things like, "You're so strong. I don't know how you do it. I could never handle what you've handled." And I accepted those compliments, not realizing the cost. Because that version of strength came with rules. Don't cry in front of people. Don't need too much. Don't expect too much. Don't speak unless you're certain it won't cause conflict. That wasn't strength. That was self-erasure. It took decades for me to understand this. Real strength is not silence. Real strength is honesty, even when your voice shakes. I thought back to that pregnant woman in the kitchen, the one who nodded. For years, I told myself she was strong, and she was, but not in the way I had imagined. Her strength was survival, but survival is not the same as wholeness. Here's something important. Strength that costs you your voice will eventually cost you your peace, and peace is something you can't afford to lose. The moment this lesson fully settled in was surprisingly small. I was in a conversation, nothing dramatic. Someone dismissed something I cared about, and instead of going quiet, I spoke. I said calmly, "That matters to me." No explanation, no apology, just truth. And the world didn't collapse. No one left, no doors slammed. That moment stayed with me because it proved something I had feared for years was wrong. Silence had convinced me that speaking up would lead to loss, but silence had been the thing causing it all along. I started looking at my life differently, at all the moments I had endured quietly, and instead of feeling ashamed, I felt informed, because those moments taught me something essential. You can survive silence, but you thrive in truth. Let me ask you something. How many times have you been called strong when what you really were was unsupported? How many times did people praise your resilience without noticing your loneliness? That's not strength. That's invisibility. I stopped measuring strength by how much I could carry alone and started measuring it by how honestly I could live. That shift changed everything. I became more present, more connected, more at ease, not because life got easier, but because I stopped abandoning myself. And that is the strongest thing I've ever done. The regret didn't disappear completely, but it softened, it transformed, it became wisdom. And wisdom is a gift, even when it comes late. If I could go back, not to change what happened, but to sit beside that woman in the kitchen, I wouldn't tell her to fight harder. I wouldn't tell her to beg. I wouldn't tell her to demand anything. I would simply tell her this: you're allowed to speak. I would tell her that silence isn't the same as peace, that quiet endurance doesn't make pain disappear, it just delays its voice. I would tell her that her feelings don't need permission, not from a man, not from society, not from fear. I would tell her something else, too, that being left while pregnant isn't a reflection of her worth, it's a reflection of someone else's limitations. And staying silent about it doesn't make her stronger, it just makes her lonelier. But here's the truth. I can't go back. None of us can. We can only speak now. And now still matters. If you're listening to this and you see yourself in my story, if you stayed quiet to keep the peace, if you swallowed words to protect others, if you were praised for strength when you were really just surviving, I want you to hear this clearly. It is not too late to find your voice. Silence may have shaped part of your life, but it does not have to shape the rest of it. You can speak gently, you can speak late, but you can still speak. I learned that my story, even with regret, still holds power, because regret isn't the end. It's a signal, a reminder, a teacher. The pregnancy taught me endurance, the silence taught me consequences, the regret taught me wisdom, and wisdom is meant to be shared. So this is what I say now, to my child, to my friends, to myself, and maybe to you. Speak while you still can, not to control outcomes, not to force anyone to stay, but to honor yourself. Because strength isn't silence. Strength is truth, spoken with compassion. And peace isn't found in endurance, it's found in authenticity. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, you're not alone. And if you've been silent for a long time, your voice is still waiting.
If you're still listening, it means this story touched you. Please subscribe. Your support truly matters.